Hello, seniors and any juniors that are following along. Little Women. We are still in chapter 35, 34, 34, 34, 34. Okie dokie, let's jump right in here. Let's see. We're still talking about Jo. Yep, Jo and her writing. And I believe the last sentence I read ended like this. Her innocent experience had given her but few glimpses of the tragic world which underlies society, so regarding it in a business light, she set about supplying her deficiencies with characteristic energy. Eager to find material for stories and bent on making them original in plot, if not masterly in execution, she searched newspapers for accidents, incidents, and crimes. A little bit close. Now, crimes, did I say? She excited the suspicions of public librarians for asking for works on poisons. She studied faces in the street, kind of like we do Walmart watching. And characters, good, bad, and indifferent, all about her. She delved in the dust of ancient times for facts or fiction so old that they were as good as new, and introduced herself to folly, sin, and misery, as well as her limited opportunities allowed. She thought she was prospering finely, but unconsciously she was beginning to desecrate some of the womanliest attributes of a woman's character. She was living in a bad society, and imaginary though it was, its influence affected her. For she was feeding heart and fancy on dangerous and unsubstantial food, and was fast brushing the innocent bloom from her nature by a premature acquaintance with the darker side of life, which comes soon enough to all of us. She was beginning to feel rather than see this, for much describing of other people's passions and feelings set her to studying and speculating about her own, a morbid amusement in which healthy young minds do not voluntarily indulge. Wrongdoing always brings its own punishments, and when Jo most needed hers, she got it. I don't know whether the study of Shakespeare helped her to read character, or the natural instinct of a woman for what was honest, brave, and strong, but while endowing her imaginary heroes with every perfection under the sun, Jo was discovering a live hero who interested her in spite of many human imperfections. Here we go. Mr. Bauer. Mr. Byer, actually, is probably how to say it. In one of her conversations, had advised her to study simple, true, and lovely characters wherever she found them, as good training for a writer. Jo took him at his word, for she coolly turned round and studied him, a proceeding which would have much surprised him had he known it, for the worthy professor was very humble in his own conceit. Why everybody liked him was what puzzled Jo at first. He was neither rich nor great, young nor handsome, in no respect what is called fascinating, imposing, or brilliant, and yet he was as attractive as a genial fire, and people seemed to gather about him as naturally as about a warm hearth. He was poor, yet always appeared to be giving something away. A stranger, yet everyone was his friend. No longer young, but as happy-hearted as a boy. Plain and peculiar, yet his face looked beautiful to many, and his oddities were freely forgiven for his sake. Joe often watched him trying to discover the charm and at last decided that it was benevolence which worked the magic, the miracle. If he had any sorrow, it sat with its head under its wing, and he turned only his sunny side to the world. There were lines upon his forehead, but time seemed to have touched him gently, remembering how kind he was to others. The pleasant curves around his mouth were the memorials of many friendly words and cheery laughter and cheery laughs. His eyes were never cold or hard, and his big hand had a warm, strong grasp that was more expressive than words. His very clothes seemed to partake of the hospitable nature of the wearer. They looked as if they were at ease and liked to make him comfortable. His capacious waistcoat was suggestive of a large heart underneath. His rusty coat had a social air, and the baggy pockets plainly proved the little hands often went in empty and came out full. His very boots were benevolent, and his collars never stiff and raspy like other people's. "That's it," said Jo to herself, and when she at length discovered that genuine goodwill toward one's fellow men could beautify and dignify even a stout German teacher who shoveled in his dinner, darned his own socks, and was burdened with the name of, how'd I say it, Bear? I guess it's like Bear. Bhaer. I've been saying Bauer, but it's more like Bear, I think. Jo valued goodness highly, but she also possessed a most feminine respect for intelligence. And a little discovery which she made about the professor added much to her regard for him. He never spoke of himself, and no one ever knew that in his native city he had been a man much honored and esteemed for learning and integrity. Still a countryman came to see him, and in conversation with Miss Norton divulged the pleasing fact. From her, Jo learned it, and liked it all the better because Mr. Bear had never told it. She felt proud to know that he was an honored professor in Berlin, though only a poor language master in America, and his homely, hard-working life was much beautified by the spice of romance which this discovery gave it. Another and better gift from intellect was shown her in a most unexpected manner. Miss Norton had the entree into literary society, which Jo would have had no chance of seeing but for her. The solitary woman felt an interest in an ambitious girl, and kindly conferred many favors of this sort both on Jo and the professor. She took them with her one night to a select symposium held in honor of several celebrities. Jo went prepared to bow down and adore the mighty ones whom she had worshipped with youthful enthusiasm afar off. But her reverence for genius received a severe shock that night, and it took her some time to recover from the discovery that the great creatures were only men and women after all. Imagine her dismay on stealing a glance of timid admiration at the poets whose lines suggested an ethereal being fed on spirit, fire, and dew, to behold him devouring his supper with an ardor which flushed his intellectual countenance. Turning us from a fallen idol, he made other discoveries which rapidly dispelled her romantic illusions. The great novelist vibrated between two decanters with the regularity of a pendulum. The famous divine flirted openly with one of the Madame de Staëls, of the age who looked daggers at another Corinne. Whew, sleepy already. Oh. Reading and stitching. I'm not getting much done. I don't know what's happening. My iron's wearing off. I need to dig into my brand new coffee. Whew. Who was amiably satirizing her after outmaneuvering her in efforts to absorb the profound philosopher who imbibed tea, Johnsonly, and appeared to slumber. I ain't gonna try to say that again. The loquacity of the lady rendering speech impossible. That's me. The scientific celebrities, forgetting their mollusk and glacial periods, gossiped about art while devoting themselves to oysters and ices with characteristic energy. The young musician, who was charming in the city like a second Orpheus, talked horses, and the specimen of the British nobility presented happened to be the most ordinary man of the party. Before the evening was half over, Jo felt so completely delusionée that she sat down in a corner to recover herself. Mr. Bear soon joined her, looking rather out of his element, and presently several of the philosophers, each mounted on his hobby, came ambling up to hold an intellectual tournament in the recess. The conversation was miles beyond Jo's comprehension, but she enjoyed it. Though Kant and Hegel were unknown gods, the subjective and objective, unintelligible terms, and the only thing evolved from her inner consciousness was a bad headache after it was all over. It dawned upon her gradually that the world was being picked to pieces and put together on new, it says, and according to the talkers, on infinitely better principles than before, that religion was in a fair way to be reasoned into nothingness, and intellect was to be the only God. Jo knew nothing about philosophy or metaphysics of any sort, but a curious excitement, half pleasurable, half painful, came over her as she listened, with the secret of being turned adrift into time and space like a young balloon out on a holiday. She looked round to see how the professor liked it, and found him looking at her with the grimmest expression she had ever seen him wear. He shook his head and beckoned her to come away. But she was fascinated just then by the freedom of speculative philosophy, and kept her seat, trying to find out what the wise gentleman intended to rely upon after they annihilated all the old beliefs. Mr. Bear was a definite man, and slow to offer his own opinions, not because they were unsettled, but too sincere and earnest to be lightly spoken. As he glanced from Jo to the several other young people, attracted by the brilliancy of the philosophic pyrotechnics, he knit his brows and longed to speak, fearing that some inflammable young soul would be led astray by the rockets, to find, when the display was over and they had only an empty stick or a scorched hand. He bore it as long as he could, but when he was appealed to for an opinion, he blazed up with honest indignation, and defended religion with all the eloquences of truth. and eloquence which made his broken English musical, and his plain face beautiful. He had a hard fight, for the wise men argued well, but he didn't know when he was beaten. Come on, Paige. When he was beaten and stood, I 59, yeah, and stood to his colors like a man. Somehow, as he talked and the world got right again to Joe, the old beliefs that had lasted so long seemed better than the new God. God was not a blind force, and immortality was not a pretty fable, but a blessed fact. She felt as if she had solid ground under her feet again, and when Mr. Bear passed, out-talked but not one whit convinced, Joe wanted to clap her hands and thank him. She didn't either, but she remembered the scene and gave the professor her heartiest respect, for she knew it cost him an effort to speak out then and there, because his conscience would not let him be silent. She began to set that character as a better possession than money, rank, intellect, or beauty, and to feel that if greatness is what wise men has to find it to be, truth, reverence, and goodwill, then her friend Frederick Bear was not only good, but great. The belief strengthened daily. She valued his esteem, coveted his respect. She wanted to be worthy of the friendship, and just when the wish was sincerest, she came near losing everything. And just when the wish was, she came near losing everything. It all grew out of the cocked hat. For one evening, the professor came in to give Joe her lesson, with a paper soldier cap on his head, which Tina had put there, and he had forgotten to take it off. It's evident he doesn't pink in his glass before coming down, thought Joe with a smile, as she said, "Good evening," as he said, "Good evening," and sat soberly down, quite unconscious of the ludicrous contrast between his subject and his headgear, for he was going to read her The Death of Wollaston. She said nothing at first, for she liked to hear him laugh out his big hearty laugh when anything funny happened. As she left to discover for himself, and presently forgot all about it. Golly, y'all, I'm going to have to stop. I hate to do this, but I feel like I'm not making any sense. Oh, I'm so sorry, y'all. So terrible sorry. It's like torture. I'm sure it is to y'all, too. Pick up the book and read it. Or listen to the audio book. Woo, we'll get through it. A little at a time. A little at a time. So we're still on chapter 34, friend, and really and truly, we don't have too much more, but probably about 6, 7, 8 pages, and I'm going. So, I even slept better last night. Woo! Get a little, I don't even know if this stuff has caffeine in it, but I've been drinking plenty of, caffeine. Drinking plenty of coffee. I still have to get to the juniors. I'm going to have to wake up a little bit more. I love y'all. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. And I hope y'all are having a great day, evening. The weather here in North Carolina is just as lovely as it can be. I had a nice visit with Teresa Patton. It was short before I had other stuff to do, but it was a nice little visit. And I went to bless her with some yarn, but she blessed me with some wool. Beautiful, beautiful wool. Bless her heart. I feel sorry for anybody that is allergic. Because here we are, loving yarn and Sandy Crochet A. Oh, Canadian girl, excuse me. Anyway, see you tomorrow. Love you. Bye-bye.